She walked into a glittering gala, and within minutes they ripped up her invitation, called her trash, and live-streamed her humiliation to the world. What none of them knew: she was the daughter of a billionaire, and that night would flip the lives of everyone in the room. This is the story of how arrogance collapsed, dignity rose, and a global movement began. Subscribe now, because you don't want to miss stories like this. The National Art Museum glowed like a glass ship anchored in a sea of lights. Marble steps fanned out wide, every surface polished to a quiet gleam. Orchids overflowed from crystal vases tall as children. A string quartet hovered in the background, bow strokes feathering the air, while champagne sparkled in every lifted glass. Everything about the evening was curated, controlled, precise. Elena Ward paused at the top of the staircase and steadied her breath. She wore a simple navy dress that brushed her ankles, the kind of fabric that fell clean without shimmer or glitter. She knew most guests would choose sequins, jewels, gowns meant to blind the camera flash. Elena had chosen not to compete. She had chosen herself and a folded invitation, heavy with embossed ink. The Cartwrights arrived the way hurricanes arrive, loud enough that you felt the air pressure shift. Vanessa, matriarch, chin sharp, hair in sculpted waves, her champagne-colored gown clinging like molten glass. Richard, broad-shouldered, diamond tie pin glinting at his collar. Dylan, their golden son, tuxedo tailored to cut a silhouette that cameras adored. Aria, the younger daughter, emerald silk flowing as she sized people up like weights on a jeweler's scale. They walked in a cluster of greetings, flashbulbs, and sycophants. Where the Cartwrights went, attention followed. Vanessa's laugh carried like perfume, cloying and deliberate. She let her gaze land on Elena. "Oh dear," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Did the catering staff get lost again?" "Sweetheart, the service entrance is around back." Elena looked up, her eyes a dark steady brown with flecks of green that caught the light. She smiled, polite. "Thank you. But I'm a guest." The word guest fell into the room like a pin on glass. Dylan's grin widened. His phone was already up, recording. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got ourselves a live case study. Watch closely, this is what happens when wishful thinking crashes a velvet rope." Elena raised the invitation, steady in her hand. She meant to hand it to the check-in staff. But Vanessa's manicured fingers snapped forward, faster than Elena could blink. The card was gone, pinched between red-polished nails. "Let's take a look," Vanessa purred, lifting it high so half the hall could see. "Decent print job. But Queens has plenty of copy shops." "Mrs. Cartwright," Elena said evenly. "Please return it." Vanessa tilted her head, smiling like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. "Please, such a lovely word. Shame it doesn't come with credibility." She folded the card once, then again, until it was thick between her fingers. And then rip, paper shredded. Pieces floated down like confetti no one asked for. Phones rose higher. The sound of tearing carried far, and the sudden hush. Elena lowered to her knees. No rush, no tears. She picked up each fragment with a calm that unsettled everyone watching. Her hands, slim and steady, treated the scraps like fallen leaves, aligning the broken edges so words became visible again. Around her, the crowd closed ranks. Glasses tilted. Dresses brushed forward. The Cartwrights circled as if on cue, camera lights sparking like predator eyes. A young guard stepped up, torn between orders and his conscience. "Ma'am, would you like me to—" "Yes," Vanessa cut in smoothly. "Clear the air. People paid $10,000 a seat. They shouldn't have to trip over." "This," Elena rose, fragments gathered in her palm. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted. "We could resolve this quietly," she said. "Quiet doesn't trend," Aria murmured. Smirking, Dylan laughed, tightening his shot. "Don't worry, folks, it's all educational. Consider this a free seminar in social boundaries." His live chat ticked upward by the second. Comments spilled like gasoline. Throw her out already. This is so cringe. Who even let her in? On the outer ring, not everyone was entertained. Dr. Miriam Cole, a respected surgeon, whispered to her husband, "This isn't right. This is cruelty." Daniel Suarez, a city welfare director, clenched his jaw, half raising his hand as if he might step in, then stopped. The Cartwright circle was a wall too tight to breach. Vanessa moved closer, her perfume sharp. She lowered her voice, just enough for the phones to still capture it. "Sweetheart, the world runs on doors. Some open. Most don't, and not for you." Elena's gaze held hers. "Funny," she said softly. "How often the people guarding doors forget who built the house." Dylan barked a laugh. "Oh, poetry. Love that." Richard shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his cufflinks. The seasoned businessman in him recognized when a game was starting to spin out of control. But pride or fear kept him silent. Vanessa's hand brushed Elena's elbow, a nudge dressed up as civility. Just enough for cameras. Just enough to signal dominance. Phones zoomed closer. The room leaned in. Even the string quartet in the back fell silent, bows suspended midair. Elena's phone buzzed inside her clutch, once, twice, over and over. She ignored it, until the screen lit long enough for the nearest guests to glimpse the name. "Jonathan Ward." Dylan Streen hiccuped. "Oh, she's calling for backup," he said, grinning, though sweat had started to beat at his temple. Elena withdrew the phone and with deliberate calm pressed dial. The ringing was loud in the hush, each tone bouncing off marble like a gavel. She lifted it to her ear. Her voice carried, steady, unshaken. "Hi, Dad. Yes, I'm still at the museum. You should probably hear what the Cartwright family really thinks about. People like me." A current tore through the crowd. Faces stiffened. Murmurs rose like wind before a storm. The name Ward wasn't unfamiliar, it was everywhere. On tech journals, on philanthropy boards, on stock tickers that scrolled across CNBC, Ward Global Technologies. Vanessa froze mid-smile. A flicker, barely perceptible, but real. She had been so certain the girl was no one. And now she wasn't certain at all. Elena's tone never shifted. "Don't worry, I'm fine. Just a little lesson in what passes for civility around here." The guard stepped back. The MC lowered his mic. Even the Cartwrights, for the first time all evening, had no rehearsed line to reach for, because suddenly it wasn't a skirmish over etiquette anymore. It was a story with consequences. And everyone in the hall, every guest clutching a phone, every official frozen on the sidelines felt it. The door had swung open, and power itself was about to walk through. The marble doors at the far end groaned open. Conversation halted mid-sentence. Even the hum of phones recording seemed to dim. Jonathan Ward entered like gravity itself had just stepped into the room. 6'2", silver hair swept back, a charcoal Tom Ford suit cut razor sharp. He didn't need to announce his name. Half the audience already recognized the face they'd seen on magazine covers and Wall Street reports. The other half saw the way people reacted to him and understood. Two aides trailed him, one with a tablet tucked tight to her chest, the other already fielding calls on an earpiece. Behind them came a pair of attorneys in dark suits, their expressions set to no nonsense. Jonathan's eyes scanned the crowd. Not rushed, not searching, just measuring. Then he found his daughter, Elena. His voice carried easily across the hall, rich, steady. "Are you all right?" She lifted her chin, fragments of her invitation still cupped in her palm. "I'm fine, Dad, just educated." The word landed heavier than a slap. The Cartwrights, once so casually confident, shrank a fraction closer together. Vanessa's knuckles whitened around her clutch. Dylan lowered his phone an inch for the first time all night. Arya's lips parted, but no sound came. Richard's hand slipped into his pocket, where his own phone was buzzing like a trapped hornet. He knew who had been calling all evening. He knew exactly what this meant. Jonathan turned, his gaze settling on the family as if drawing a spotlight. Vanessa, Richard, Dylan, Aria. He nodded once, polite in form only. I received an interesting phone call from my daughter. Something about your definition of civility. The museum director, pale and sweating, rushed forward with her tablet. Mr. Ward, I had no idea this was your daughter. The museum takes full responsibility. Jonathan lifted one hand, silencing her without even looking. Director, you're not accountable for their behavior. But you are accountable for how this institution responds. The line snapped through the air like a whip. He turned back to Richard. Shall we talk numbers? Richard stiffened. He had spent a career weaponizing balance sheets and forecasts, but hearing them turned against him felt like drowning in his own vocabulary. Cartwright Industries, Jonathan continued, his voice smooth as glass. Current debt load, $920 million. Stock price, down 62% year to date. Last quarter's losses, $87 million. Without outside investment. He paused, letting the silence chew the rest. You'll be bankrupt in 9 weeks. The crowd reacted like a single body, gasps rippling outward. Phones whipped up higher. Suddenly, this wasn't just gossip. This was business bloodsport, live and uncensored. Jonathan's aide tapped her tablet. Sir, would you like the documentation read into record? Please, Jonathan said. Her voice was crisp, clinical. Footage from Dylan Cartwright's live stream. 4 separate clips. Content includes referring to Ms. Ward as trash, mocking her appearance, and claiming she didn't belong in civilized society. Current combined viewership, over 120,000 and climbing. Screenshots preserved. Dylan stammered. It was a joke. The aide didn't pause. Aria Cartwright, live comments mocking Ms. Ward's dress, encouraging removal. Vanessa Cartwright, physical destruction of Ms. Ward's invitation. Richard Cartwright, verbal support of exclusion. She lowered the tablet. All captured on record. Jonathan's gaze swept the family once more. Remarkable. You've managed to turn a gala into evidence. Vanessa found her voice, brittle and thin. Jonathan, I had no idea Elena was your daughter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. No, Vanessa. You knew exactly who she was. You just decided she wasn't worth respect. He let that hang. You didn't mistake her identity. You judged her appearance. Elena spoke then, her voice steady but carrying a new edge. Dad, I have a proposal. The room leaned in. She faced the Cartwrights directly. You've shown everyone here who you really are. But you also have a choice to show who you're willing to become. If you want your company and your reputation to survive, it won't be free. You'll pay in accountability. Her list was clear, unwavering, a public apology here and now. $12 million into a scholarship and community fund for underrepresented youth. Mandatory bias and ethics training for your entire executive board. Independent audits for the next 18 months with power to terminate our agreement the moment you relapse. The silence after was electric. Vanessa opened her mouth, shut it, then looked at Richard. His face was ash gray, lips pressed thin. He thought of the creditors circling, the employees counting on paychecks, the shareholders already restless. And then he looked at the wall of phones aimed at him like weapons. Finally, his shoulders sagged. We accept. Jonathan's phone buzzed. He glanced down at a message, then back at the family. The board meeting has been postponed until tomorrow morning. You have 18 hours to prove these words aren't empty. If you fail, he let the unfinished threat dangle like a blade. 9 weeks becomes 9 days. He turned to Elena, offering his arm. She slid her hand through with quiet dignity. Together, father and daughter walked toward the doors. Every phone followed. Every whisper trailed them. And in the center of the hall, the Cartwright family stood encircled, not by wealth, not by prestige, but by evidence. 6 months can feel like an eye blink or like a lifetime. For the Cartwrights, it was both. The same marble hall where Elena had once been cornered was lit again tonight, but differently. No harsh circles of phones aimed at one young woman. Instead, rows of chairs faced a broad stage, screens casting a soft professional glow. The banners read, "The Ward Cartwright Responsibility Forum Building Equity. Building Trust. Building the Future." For the first time in memory, no one cared about designer gowns. Attendees arrived in understated suits and plain dresses, the kind that didn't scream brand but whispered purpose. The Cartwright name on the banner had shifted, to no longer shorthand for unchecked privilege, but for a fragile experiment in corporate redemption. Vanessa sat in the front row, posture straight but stripped of her usual armor. No diamonds tonight, no glittering clutch. Just a navy dress, her notes folded neatly on her lap. Richard sat beside her, his hands pressed together like a man holding something fragile, his company, his reputation, his chance. And then the lights dimmed. The museum director, voice steady this time, took the podium. 6 months ago, she began. This institution witnessed an incident that could have destroyed careers, reputations, and lives. Instead, through accountability and action, it has become a catalyst for change. A ripple of acknowledgement moved through the audience. Everyone remembered. How could they not? The videos had racked up millions of views, dissected by analysts and activists alike. The phrase Cartwright Gala incident had become shorthand for arrogance laid bare. Now, the same family had been dragged kicking, screaming, learning into a different story. Vanessa rose, adjusting the mic with hands that no longer trembled from adrenaline but from humility. Her voice carried differently, lower, steadier. "I want to address the obvious," she said. 6 months ago, I tore up a young woman's invitation in this very room. I called her an intruder. I humiliated her because I decided her presence didn't fit my picture of belonging. That woman was Elena Ward, and she is the reason I'm standing here tonight. Not as a host, but as a student. The audience leaned in. Vanessa's eyes searched the crowd, and for once she wasn't looking for approval. She was looking for honesty. I've spent these months in training, in neighborhoods I'd never bothered to step into. I've worked at food banks. I've listened to stories from people I used to step past. I've had to face the ugliest truth of all, that the problem wasn't ignorance. It was arrogance. She clicked the screen behind her. Photographs appeared. Her serving meals at a shelter. Her sitting cross-legged in a circle with high school students in Harlem. Her listening, really listening to people she once ignored. A voice from the back whispered, "She looks different." And she did. The glow wasn't jewelry anymore. It was something less tangible, and far harder to fake. Then Dylan took the stage. The same Dylan whose TikTok had turned cruelty into sport. He looked older, not in years, but in weight. "My videos from that night passed 1 million views in 48 hours, he began, voice raw. "And for days, I couldn't breathe. The whole world was watching me be the worst version of myself." He pulled out his phone, projecting his latest uploads. Interviews with college students about bias, explainers about privilege, collaborations with nonprofits. His follower count had doubled, but the comments scrolling across the screen were different now. "Thank you for using your platform for good. This is the kind of content we need." 6 months ago, I pointed a camera at someone to strip them of dignity, Dylan said. Today, I use it to hand dignity back. And I know one doesn't cancel the other. I'll carry that weight forever. But carrying it means I'll never forget it. Aria followed with her own story of turning away from luxury posts to highlighting education reform. Richard stepped up with slides showing their company's transformation. Minority leaders in management up from 3% to 29%. Women in executive roles rising to 44%. Over a third of their supplier contracts now with minority-owned businesses. This isn't charity, Richard said, voice firmer than anyone expected. It's survival. Not just of our company, but of our integrity. And then Elena, she walked on stage not as a victim, but as something sharper. A symbol, a leader. The audience erupted into applause before she even spoke. 6 months ago, Elena began, I stood in this very hall with scraps of paper in my hand. They told me I didn't belong. But tonight, I'm not here to remind you of what happened. I'm here to remind you of what followed. She gestured toward the audience. This room is filled with people who chose to turn shame into action. Executives who rewrote policies. Students who demanded bias training. Families who admitted they had blind spots. And the Cartwright family who could have hidden, could have deflected, but instead chose to change. She paused, letting the weight settle. Redemption isn't forgiveness. It's work. Hard, uncomfortable work. And tonight, we measure not apologies, but actions. The applause was thunderous, backstage. Jonathan Ward stood watching, his expression unreadable but his eyes alive. For him, this was more than a corporate experiment. It was proof of what he'd always told his daughter. Power isn't the ability to humiliate. It's the courage to transform humiliation into change. And as the crowd rose to their feet, Elena glanced back once at the Cartwrights in the front row. Their faces were different, now not because they'd shed their wealth, but because for the first time, they seemed to understand its weight. The assembly hall in Geneva was designed to hold the world. The curved walls rose like cupped hands, gathering the voices of nations into one vast space. On this evening, every seat was filled. Delegates leaned forward in their chairs, translators adjusted headsets, and the buzz of expectation rose and fell like a tide dot at the front. The podium stood beneath a screen displaying her name, Elena Ward, Vice President. Ward Global Social Impact. It still startled her sometimes, how far that title carried. Only 2 years ago, she had been a woman standing alone in a circle of laughter, clutching the torn fragments of an invitation. Tonight, she was the keynote speaker at the United Nations. Elena drew a breath, steady but weighted. She remembered her father's words in the hotel suite that morning. Speak to them like you spoke to me that night, calm, clear, and let the truth do the rest. She stepped to the microphone. The hall hushed. 2 years ago, Elena began, I was humiliated in front of hundreds of people at a charity gala in New York City. My invitation was torn in half. My presence was mocked. I was told I did not belong. The words dropped into the silence like stones into water, rippling outward. Some delegates nodded. They had seen the viral footage. Others stared, hearing it for the first time. But humiliation, Elena continued, does not always end where it begins. That night, my father walked into the hall and demanded accountability. The family who humiliated me faced a choice: deny, deflect, or change. What followed was not easy, but it became something bigger than a scandal. It became a model. Behind her, the screen lit with numbers, 1,247 corporations, worldwide now following the Ward Cartwright model. Discrimination. Complaints down 34% in participating organizations. Minority leadership up 89%. Billions invested in community scholarships and equity funds. This is not charity, Elena said, her voice hardening. This is accountability. This is proof that when prejudice is exposed, it can either rot institutions or remake them. Applause rose, scattered at first, then swelling into a wave. Faces behind the figures. The screen changed again. Photographs appeared one by one. Marcus Johnson, once a warehouse supervisor ignored by executives, now regional director overseeing 3 plants. Maria Santos, a junior analyst whose proposal saved millions, promoted to head of global logistics. Dr. James Brooks, a black scientist sidelined for years, now leading the research team that delivered Cartwright's most profitable patent in a decade. These people, Alina said, didn't need handouts. They needed opportunity. And once they had it, they proved talent has no zip code, no skin color, no predetermined ceiling. The applause this time was immediate, fierce. Delegates from smaller nations clapped especially hard. They understood the sting of being overlooked. In the front row, the Cartwright family sat under the same lights that had once revealed their arrogance. Now those lights revealed something different. Vanessa wore a simple blazer, her hands folded neatly, no jewelry glittering on her fingers. Richard's once proud shoulders slumped slightly, but not from defeat. From the weight of a lesson finally learned. Dylan sat with a phone in his lap, not streaming mockery, but taking notes for his next advocacy video. Arya adjusted her legal pad. She was now an attorney specializing in civil rights law. They weren't saints. They weren't absolved. But they were transformed enough to sit there, unflinching, as Alina reminded the world of their failure in their work. Since Elena's voice sharpened. The lesson is not that the Cartwrights changed. The lesson is that change is possible. And necessary. Every community, every company, every nation has doors. Too often, those doors are closed for the wrong reasons. Her words fell like verdicts. In Brussels, the European Union had already passed sweeping corporate equity laws modeled on Ward Cartwright. In South Africa, legislation required foreign corporations to reinvest profits into local communities. In Australia, all public sector employees now underwent mandatory bias training. In Latin America, universities had adopted the model into their leadership curricula. Even in classrooms across the United States, teachers screened her documentary. Dignity Interrupted. In 23 languages, it told the story of one night when cruelty was turned inside out. That evening, after the speech, Alina found herself in a reception room overlooking Lake Geneva. The windows stretched floor to ceiling, reflecting the city lights. Her father stood by her side, glass of sparkling water in hand. "You sounded like a head of state," Jonathan Ward said quietly. She laughed. "I'm just telling the truth." "No," he corrected. "You're wielding it." He set the glass down, his silver hair catching the light. "I watched you transform humiliation into a movement. That's not just leadership, Alina, that's courage." She glanced at the wall of photographs in her phone. Scholarship recipients, newly promoted employees, families lifted by the programs sparked by that night. "I learned something important," she said. "When people try to diminish you, they're not exposing your worth. They're exposing their fear." Her father nodded slowly. "And you turned their fear into fuel." Meanwhile, in a smaller press room, the Cartwright family gave their own briefing. Vanessa spoke first, her voice stripped of its old gloss. "2 years ago, I believed my wealth gave me the right to decide who mattered. I was wrong. I tore up an invitation. I tore at a person's dignity. That shame will follow me forever. But so will the work I do now to make sure I am not the last to change." She held up her book, The $500 Million Lesson, Learning to See My Own Privilege. It had already become required reading at several universities. Dylan leaned in. "I turned my phone into a weapon. Today, I try to make it a tool. My new platform, Privilege Check, is about conversations I should have had years ago. We talk about bias, about responsibility, about growth. And millions of young people listen, not because I'm perfect, but because I admit I wasn't." Arya announced the opening of a nonprofit clinic providing free legal aid for marginalized entrepreneurs. Richard closed with numbers, but they weren't stock figures anymore. They were statistics about jobs created, scholarships awarded, supply contracts with minority-owned firms. The reporters in the room didn't clap. They weren't supposed to. But the air carried a sense of something rare, sincerity. The ripple stretched far beyond boardrooms. In Nairobi, a group of young activists used the Ward Cartwright framework to pressure local corporations into hiring practices that reflected their communities. In Mumbai, a startup incubator redirected funding toward women entrepreneurs. In Sao Paulo, a city council cited Elena's speech while drafting municipal equity laws. In Seoul, universities integrated her case into ethics courses for business majors. Everywhere, the story was retold not as scandal, but as transformation. But perhaps the most powerful shift came from ordinary people. A teacher in Detroit shared how she showed the gala footage to her students, then asked them to write essays on dignity. A nurse in Johannesburg recounted standing up for a patient after realizing bias had blinded her before. A shop owner in Manila taped Elena's quote, "True power is the courage to transform humiliation into change," to the front of his store. One night, Elena scrolled through social media and found a teenager in Lagos had stitched together clips of her speech, captioning it, "She made me believe my place at the table is real." It had already been viewed 1,000,000 times. 2 years after that night in New York, the legacy was undeniable. Cartwright Industries had rebounded, stronger and more diverse. Ward Global had become the model for corporate accountability. Governments had reshaped their laws. Students, workers, families carried the story like a torch. But Elena's closing words at the UN carried the truest legacy. True power isn't the ability to humiliate others. True power is transforming moments of cruelty into opportunities for justice. If the Cartwrights could change, then so can you, the hall had roared. But more importantly, the world had listened. Back in her hotel room that night, Elena opened her window to the cool Geneva air. Flags snapped in the wind outside, dozens of colors against the night sky. She touched the small scar in her memory, the echo of paper tearing, the sting of laughter. And then she thought of the hall today, filled with applause, with change, with possibility. Sometimes the most important revolutions don't start with speeches or armies. They start with someone bending down, gathering the scraps, and refusing to let them be the end of the story. Elena closed her eyes, whispering to herself words that had carried her this far. Dignity is not given. It is claimed. And once claimed, it can change the world. The museum steps were quieter now, but still grand. Elena Ward paused at the top, a decade older, a decade sharper. She was no longer just a survivor of one cruel night. She was a household name, cited in classrooms, boardrooms, and courtrooms across the world. Behind her, banners read, "The Global Dignity Summit to 10 Years of Change." Inside, the Cartwrights were there too. Not as hosts, not as villains, but as partners. Vanessa now worked as a diversity consultant. Dylan's platform had grown into an educational network with millions of subscribers. Arya ran a civil rights foundation. Richard, his hair fully gray, spent his days teaching young executives the lesson he had learned the hardest way. Integrity first, profit second. Elena stepped to the podium. Cameras flashed. But she didn't think about the humiliation anymore. She thought about the students who had scholarships, the workers promoted, the companies reformed, the laws rewritten. 10 years ago, she told the crowd, a door slammed in my face. Today, those doors stand open, not because of me, not because of one family, but because enough people chose to hold them open together. That is the legacy. That is the work. And it will never be finished. The applause rose, steady and unending, and as Elena looked out over the hall, she knew a torn invitation had become a map, guiding the world towards something better. From a torn invitation to the floor of the United Nations, Elena's journey proved a simple truth. True power is not the ability to humiliate. It's the courage to transform cruelty into change. And if the Cartwrights could turn their shame into action, maybe we all can. Remember, dignity is not given, it's claimed. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay with us. We have more stories that remind us what justice, courage, and humanity truly mean.